Hey, once again, FCF, we're still in the book of Ephesians. We're going to go back to chapter 5, and we're going to pick up in verse 28. Now, we left off where, Paul starts in verse 25 where he says, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as to the Lord. Then he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He's picking up with that thought, but he's going to add to the image of how a husband should love his wife. Verse 28, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, verse 29, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and he cares for it just as Christ does the church. And we'll stop right there. So the first image about how a husband is to love his wife is to love his wife with sacrificial devotion to her development or highest good. As Christ loves the church. The second one, he says, but love your wife like you love yourself. So you need to pause and say, well, how do you love yourself? Well, we try to keep ourselves from pain. We try to keep ourselves from harm. We try to keep ourselves healthy. We try to keep ourselves at peace. We try to keep ourselves feeling as good as is possible and so forth. So he's getting even more practical. He's saying, husbands, the same way you take care of yourself and you try to be as happy as you can, circumstances, limiting that, try to do the same towards your wife, meaning that you care about her happiness and her safety and so forth. And then he says something interesting. He says, if you're loving your wife, you're loving yourself. Now, there's a humorous component of that, because we know that if there's a rift between husbands and wives, they each feel the pain. There is a kind of oneness. He's going to discuss that later in a few verses about the oneness that a husband and wife experience. There is spiritual truth to this, that you can't have the maximum degree of peace and happiness and joy and so forth if there's a rift between your husband and wife. There will always be some pain in that because you guys you're united. There's a oneness. Again, remember what I said. God has created some context on this earth to teach us how to live the way he lives and to love the way he loves. He's always trying to move us from being self-centered and self-absorbed and selfish to being unselfish and learning how to love unselfishly and give and care for other people. So marriage is one of these wonderful contexts that just pulls us out of our selfishness. It does not allow us to retain much selfishness. If we do, we're going to have problems. We're going to feel the pain. Again, parenting does the same thing, and so does vocational work. We're forced into a context where we have to get along with other people. Once again, we learn to be unselfish. So he says, love your wife like you love yourself. He says, nobody ever hated their own body. And he says, but he feeds it and he cares for it just as Christ does the church. Now notice how he's focusing back. As he's talking about this union between a husband and wife, you're going to see in the verses that we're going to look at tomorrow, he's really been thinking the whole time of trying to give a picture to people, the followers of Christ, of the kind of union that Christ wants to have, intends to have, is going to have, will have for all eternity with his church, his assembly, his called out assembly. I'll just give you a little hint. The kind of everlasting partnership that Christ intends to have with his people is, we learn the beginning lessons of that in a marital situation. We start learning how to unselfishly partner together for unified endeavors for good. And we'll pick all that up a little further tomorrow. So we're in there for today. Thank you.